This is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, the masterpiece of fantasy fiction from 1924. This copy from the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series was published in 1969. Anyone who I mentioned this book to while reading it had never heard of it, let alone read it. However, when I bought this book a year ago while in North Carolina, it was the mass market edition with the unicorn under the stars being brought down by hounds. The bookstore clerk told me that it was her favorite book of all time, and it was incredibly inspirational to fantasy writers throughout the decades. It's no secret that it inspired the likes of Tolkien, H.P. Lovecraft, Gene Wolfe, Guillermo del Toro, Neil Gaiman, Borges, and Ursula K. Le Guin. She actually told people, and she wrote that, quote, it was Dunsany who was the first terrible fate that awaited beginners of fantasy. By this, she meant that he was so inspirational that they would want to imitate him. However, he remained over the years singularly unimitatable, though many have tried. It is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, and in this video, because I wouldn't want this plot to be spoiled for me, I'm not going to go too deeply into the points of the plot. However, I will be discussing what makes this book so important and beautiful, which is its prose, and I'll be going over the techniques that make it so fascinating, especially the way that Dunsany creates an imaginary world, his own universe through his language. This story takes place in a town called Earl. It's a rural village that borders on a magical kingdom called Elfland, also known as the Fields of Twilight. The properties of Elfland are unknown to man and is feared by man. However, the town of Earl, otherwise known as the Fields we know, are ruled by human culture, Christendom, the passage of time, and ordinary things that men of our time would know. However, there are magical elements in the fields we know, such as witches and wizards and magic as well. So basically, the plot goes like this. The people of Earl decide that they want something extraordinary to change. They want their land to be ruled by magic, and they want a magical lord, so they could bring fame to the fields we know, to Earl. They send their lord's son Alveric to Elfland to bring back the king of Elfland's daughter, the Princess Lyrizel, and thus unfolds this mythic and dreamlike tale. So the greatest joy of the book is not that plot, even though it was slightly revolutionary in its time for reasons I won't go into now, but it is its prose. It is the beautiful, sublime, poetic, gentle, yet powerful language that Dunsany uses to craft a world, and the techniques that he employs to do so. Dunsany said in his autobiography, Patches of Sunlight, that good prose should sound good when read aloud, otherwise it is not good prose. To do this, he uses the techniques of music and lyricism, such as rhythm, and throughout the story, there is a rhythmic and hypnotic quality to the prose, to the way that things sound when they're said aloud. I'm going to try to give an example of this. by reading a passage from the book, page 20. It's the first time that Alveric meets Lyrazel at the lawns of the palace of the king of Elfland. At the beauty of these lawns, Alveric stood, gazing as they shone through twilight and dew, surrounded by the mauve and ruddy glory of the massed flowers of Elfland, beside which our sunsets pale and our orchids droop, and beyond them lay like night the magical wood. And jutting from that wood, with glimmering portals, all open wide to the lawns, with windows more blue than our sky on summer's nights, as though built of starlight, shone that palace that may be only told of in song. As Alveric stood there with his sword in his hand, at the wood's edge, scarcely breathing, with his eyes looking over the lawns at the chiefest glory of Elfland, through one of those portals alone came the king of Elfland's daughter. She walked, dazzling, to the lawns without seeing Alveric. Her feet brushed through the dew and the heavy air and gently pressed for an instant the emerald grass, which bent and rose as our harebells when blue butterflies light and leave them, roaming carefree along the hills of chalk. And as she passed, he neither breathed nor moved, nor could have moved if those pines had still pursued him, but they stayed in the forest, not daring to touch those lawns. She wore a crown that seemed to be carved of great pale sapphires. She shone on those lawns and gardens like a dawn coming unaware, out of long night, on some planet nearer than us to the sun. And as she passed near Alveric, she suddenly turned her head, and her eyes opened in a little wonder. She had never before seen a man from the fields we know, and Alveric gazed in her eyes, all speechless and powerless still. It was indeed the Princess Lyrazel in her beauty, and then he saw that her crown was not sapphires, but ice. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice had the music that of earthly things was most like ice in thousands of broken pieces rocked by a wind of spring upon lakes in some northern country. And he said, "I come from the fields that are mapped and known." Forgive me for my reading may not have been as beautiful as it sounded when read quietly to myself. However, the whole of the work is like this. It is incantatory, rhythmic, hypnotic. He uses techniques that a songwriter would use. Choruses, repeating phrases, such as "the fields we know," "beyond the fields we know," "that may only be told of in song." And these phrases repeat throughout the book, like a chorus would in a song, and smaller phrases like "the crown made of ice" repeat more locally in individual passages, and it creates this trance-like atmosphere. It creates a resonance which grounds the reader in Dunsany's reality. However, it also feels ancient yet familiar and creates a dreamlike atmosphere. To better understand this work, I referenced a thesis by the scholar Skye Cervoni. It's called "Magic Words Illuminating the Role of Language in Dunsany's Fictional Prose." In it, she argues that music and song is used throughout Dunsany's work to illustrate the outer limits and the boundaries of human understanding, whether it be a memory of an idyllic past, primal wisdom, or an otherworldly realm. And in The King of Elfland's Daughter, the realm of Elfland itself is described as something that can only be understood through song. It reminds me of a work by Clark Ashton Smith called The City of the Singing Flame, in which a flame at the center of a city holds a ineffable understanding or an ineffable wisdom, and it is constantly emitting a siren's song. However, no one knows what's on the other side of the flame. Another way that Dunsany creates a world through his language is by replacing physical action and dialogue with long, drawn-out descriptive passages. Dunsany doesn't make his character explain things themselves. We see it through the texture of his language, and it is clear that Dunsany values more immaterial things like moods and atmospheres, emotions, mystery. Dunsany uses a technique called periodic sentences or anaphora, which creates chains of conjunctions in a sentence, which pulls the reader through with a gravity that almost feels sacred or ancient. For example, in this passage, he's describing the character of Orion, who is Alvric's son. And little he knew of the things that ink may do, how it may mark a dead man's thoughts for the wonder of later years, and tell of happenings that are gone clean away, and be a voice for us out of the dark of time, and save many a fragile thing from the pounding of heavy ages, or carry to us over the rolling centuries, even a song from lips long dead on forgotten hills. Little knew he of ink. His word choice here is also extremely deliberate. He uses very few adjectives. However, when he does, they carry emotional weight, not merely describing what something looks like. Something like forgotten hills or heavy ages. They evoke a sense of memory and loss more than something's appearance. So another technique that Dunsany uses in the novel is chiasmus, which is repeating a concept in reverse order. For instance, when Alvric approaches Elfland, he senses an understanding that reaches from trees to men and from men to trees. This is suggesting that magic lies in the unity between man and the natural world. Also, the realm of Elfland is personified in the novel. It behaves like a living organism. When the king of Elfland is mourning Elfland's loss of his daughter, it's described that all Elfland shivers. The magic of Elfland is held between the characters, the natural world, and the magic itself. Therefore, all of it is personified. So one of the most interesting things that I found myself doing while reading this book was looking up all of the uses of natural imagery that Dunsany scattered throughout the work. Plants, animals, minerals, landscapes. I wanted to see pictures of them so that I could better visualize them. He uses those images to describe the unknowable things in Elfland, because those are the things that actually exist in our world. The only way we could possibly understand what's going on over there is to imagine things that are here and draw comparisons. Like in that passage I read before, when Lyrazel is stepping onto the lawns, it's described like how a blue butterfly would light on a harebell. So I wanted to understand what a harebell would be, because I had never heard of what that even would be. I think that something that I haven't touched on is how humorous this book does come off at some moments, especially the characters of the troll, and the entire last few chapters. I was so excited to feel the effect of what bringing the magic into the world actually did to the people and the lessons they learned through it. There are these trolls who come over from Elfland who are completely alien to the fields we know, and they think everything is so funny. And the same goes for Lyrizel. She can't be bothered to make things that should be serious not funny to her. She can't learn how to pray or to worship like humans do. She can't make herself be somber when she's from a world of joy and beauty and constant relaxation, it seems, or constant contemplation would be a better word for it. There's a great scene where she's trying to learn how to pray, and when she finds things that she would like to pray to, Alveric makes her feel bad about it, and it ultimately leads to one of the reasons why Alveric and Lyrizel can't be together. The greatest tragedy of this novel, and going on into the second half of the book. I'm going to read a passage from that moment here. With face upturned to all that wandering host, she stood long silent, obedient to Alveric. Then she lowered her eyes, and there was a small pool glimmering in the night, in which all the faces of the stars were shining. To pray to the stars, she said to herself in the night, is surely wrong. These images in the water are not the stars. I will pray to their images, and the stars will know. And on her knees amongst the irised leaves, she prayed at the edge of the pool and gave thanks to the images of the stars for the joy she had of the night. When the constellations shone in their myriad majesty and moved like an army dressed in silver mail, marching from unknown victories to conquer in distant wars. There's a humorous tension and a poignant one that comes from Lyrizel's inability to adapt. And the same goes for the trolls, especially when they try to understand the language of animals and the goings-ons of humans. Another thing that I loved about the book were these matter-of-fact moments of how Dunsany creates a small little lore that may have been made up or may have been just from his imagination about how certain animals and certain mythical creatures will pass the boundaries of Elfland from the fields we know, or from Elfland back and forth, such as foxes. He describes the fox as a creature that is known to the beasts of Elfland, and how trolls are known to foxes because they may come back and forth and see each other, but not pass so far to go into the towns of Earl or other towns. The themes in this novel include longing for something unreachable, something that can't be done. Also, the tensions between magic and modernity, as well as the passage of time. The passage of time is explored through the ontological boundary between Elfland and Earl. This happens because they exist side by side in completely separate realities. The passage of time doesn't occur in Elfland, which is why things there don't age and don't die. The seasons don't change. The sun doesn't rise. There is an eternal now that every being enjoys there. So the ways their mind work and the ways that their culture and relationships form is completely based on that huge aspect. The tensions between modernity and magic is something that was also explored by Tolkien in his later work. He describes the influence of technology, modern man, and even rationality as something that threatens magic, which would be something that would be fragile and can't adapt to something that isn't so ancient, something so new like human technology and modernity. One of the most fascinating insights I found was also from Cervoni's thesis. In it, she compares how Dunsany writes his prose to how the witch in The King of Elfland's daughter, Zrundrel, creates a magic sword for Alaric. She can't use ordinary fire to forge the sword. She imbues it with a rune, which is a magical letter, technically, even though it's not exactly described very well how it looks. It is also with a song that she sings while forging this magical sword. This process mirrors how Dunsany's language isn't full of complex systems. The story, the plot isn't full of explicit lore or complex things that you need to understand before reading the novel. It's mostly the structure and the individual magic words, which is the titular magic words thesis by Cervoni. So The King of Elfland's Daughter, it's an extremely beautiful and memorable piece. You should definitely read it, even though I've told you bits of the plot. It's not something that I can spoil for you how this book will make you feel while going through the process of reading it. It isn't memorable because of the plot. Ultimately, it's memorable because of the way it makes you feel. It's not that Dunsany describes magic and systems. The words that you read themselves feel magical while you're reading them. And it's even more so impressive that over a century later, that feeling, as far as I can imagine, remains undiminished. I feel so inspired to write my own short stories now that I've read Dunsany's masterpiece and had been getting into his short stories. It was a long time coming, I feel, but anyone out there who still hasn't read this, I highly recommend it. Even if you're just wanting to understand the history of the fantasy genre more, check this out. It's The King of Elfland's Daughter. Thanks so much for coming by.